My name is Karen Savage, and I am the project manager for Adoptive, which is New Hampshire's version, very small version of MARE. I am also a foster and adoptive parent. I have one biological daughter who is 13, or will be 13 at the end of this week. And then we've adopted 2 children from foster care. One is now 7 and one is 2.5, and both of those children had substance exposure prenatally.
And I'm Volz-Benoit. I'm also a foster and adoptive parent. My husband and I have 6 children. Yeah.
I know, I was like,
surprise.
I'm great. I'm like,
We didn't plan it that way. DCF kept calling and we're like, yeah, why not? Our oldest child we are the legal guardian for through the court system, because private adoption is not legal in the state. You have to go through an agency. And then I have 4 that are adopted through DCF, and then we have 1 foster child that we are going to TPR at the end of the month. So hopefully we get to keep her. If not, maybe we'll do this again. DCF does cut you off at 6 children, so if we adopt her, she'll be the last. And I also went over to the dark side, and about 18 months ago I started working for DCF. I'm the regional nurse for the western part of the state, so I cover Hampshire, Hampden, Franklin, and Berkshire counties. I have several children that were substance exposed. One, my oldest, cocaine caused a premature birth. The mother had placenta ruptura, which caused significant medical problems that we have been overcoming for the past 11 years, almost 12. He'll be 12 in December. Was not supposed to live out of the NICU, but he's going strong and he's doing fantastic, and he's probably one of the happiest kids you'll ever see in your life. He's that kind of kid that you see him and he lights up the entire room. So.
Awesome. Just to kind of throw a statistic out there, because we both talked about our adopted kids who have substance exposure. The latest statistics say that 60 to 80% of kids in foster care have had substance exposure. So there's a really good chance, if you adopt a child out of foster care, that they're going to have had some substance exposure. We're going to talk today about some of the realities of that, what that can look like. We're going to talk a little bit about how to advocate if you do have a child that's had substance exposure, how to advocate to make sure their needs are met. But also try to tell you not to be scared off by it. I know we were just talking when you're filling out that questionnaire in your home study of what you will and do and don't feel comfortable parenting. It can be really hard and it can sound really scary. Oh, my quote disappeared. Hold on one second. Maybe not. Oh, there we go. I put that quote up there just to remind you that these children are not their diagnoses, whether it's a substance exposure diagnosis or otherwise, and they are all precious. And the things you hear, the things you read on paper may sound very scary, but when you meet a child and you realize they're just a child, it totally opens your eyes to the potential, and so it gets way less scary.
And we're not trying to scare you off. I mean, there are tools and supports that you can use to help parent these children. And you're not always going to know. DCF doesn't always know that these children are substance exposed. My second oldest, his mother had him at home in the bathtub. They're not sure because nobody was able to drug test. There are local hospitals that don't drug test unless the child is showing withdrawal symptoms. We were just talking about how some hospitals in Karen's area don't drug test regularly. I just had a case where a child was born at 22 and 2 weeks, so 22 weeks and 2 days, by a mother with a history of cocaine use from a placenta abruptia, which is placenta abruptia is the #1 cause is cocaine use, and they did not drug test the mother. So DCF may not always know that a child is substance exposed, whether it's opiates, alcohol, marijuana, and even legal drugs,
Mhm.
like oxys or Wellbutrin. That's not a good one. Subutex and methadone. So if a mother is in treatment and she's on methadone, children still withdraw from methadone, as well as Subutex, which is the pregnancy-safe version of Suboxone.
The reality is anything the mother's ingesting can
Mhm.
cross through the placenta. So the alcohol exposure is the substance that most is known about. I'm sure you've all heard of fetal alcohol syndrome. Our son's bio mom was an admitted alcoholic and gave birth in her rooming house. Did not know she was pregnant until he came out. And so we know he had alcohol exposure and high doses of alcohol. He came to us when he was 3, pretty intensive trauma history. He's now 7, and we are just starting to kind of understand how this has affected him. Another thing to take into consideration is children from foster care aren't just dealing with substance exposure, there's trauma history. And even a child who comes, our daughter came home from the NICU to us, but she had the trauma of domestic violence when she was in utero, she tested positive for 7 substances, and she had a very traumatic delivery birth. She had to be air flighted to Boston and was then brought back to New Hampshire, was in the NICU for 6 weeks going through medical withdrawals. She had to be given morphine because of her traumatic birth, so they not only had to detox her from the substances mom had used, but also the morphine. So it took about 6 weeks for her. She was very tiny, so she was also struggling with weight gain. You see her now, she is a happy, beautiful 2.5-year-old, but she has some issues. We have several specialists she sees. She's in speech therapy, but she's amazing. And so with alcohol, there's a lot more research done. And somebody was just asking, what research has been done on opiates? There honestly isn't enough research that's been done on opiates. And most of the research that's done, it has been done on children who've been adopted. As Eric said, you don't see a lot of biological families that are willing to talk about how their substance use may have affected their child. That's a hard thing to acknowledge. But the little research that has been done shows that environment is the biggest factor for kids who've had, other than alcohol. There was a 25-year study done on crack cocaine babies, and what they found was that after 25 years, they looked no different. There were always the extremes. He mentioned his child that was born very early. There can be other factors that play into it, but on average, there was no differences between the children who'd been crack cocaine exposed and those who hadn't. In similar studies, much fewer and not as long-term have been done on opiates, and they find the same conclusion, that when the children are adopted into a safe environment, loving environment, that is way more important than what they were exposed to in utero. Yep.
And by that example, do you mean the placenta issue that you said cocaine is more likely to may cause medical issues earlier in life?
Right.
That is a real thing.
Right.
But your point is the long game.
Right.
As long as you push
yes.
through,
Yeah.
For this particular substance, actually
exactly.
there may not be a meaningful
Right,
difference.
right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Barring
Barring medical complexities,
Right.
a lot of what you see with substance-exposed children are behavioral issues.
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of behavioral issues, and I don't, like Karen said, there's not enough research on it to know that if it's trauma from early childhood,
Yeah, 'cause you can't separate them.
Mhm.
or
It's very hard to see,
ADHD, ADHD and trauma are very hard to separate from each
Mhm.
other. Behavioral issues, learning disabilities, poor social skills, occupational therapy issues. Like one of my kids has a problem holding a spoon or a fork.
Yep,
Yeah.
our son does. He has some fine motor issues. And even with fetal alcohol, we were talking about, there used to be fetal alcohol syndrome, and it was a very specific criteria for diagnosis. There were facial features that had to be diagnosed at birth, and what they've now learned is that similar to autism, there is a whole spectrum of fetal alcohol. They call it fetal alcohol spectrum disorder now. And you have the extreme end is fetal alcohol syndrome, where they have full-blown symptoms, but there then is a whole spectrum. Our son does not have the facial features, and initially when we asked about screening, the pediatrician said no, but now we've gone back to him as he's gotten older, and we're continuing to see he hasn't grown out of these issues, that they are likely related to his alcohol exposure. He is now going to be screened. And so the diagnosis isn't the be-all, end-all of things. For us, like, we want to make sure we're meeting our son's needs. And the reality is, even if he has FASD, one of the treatments for FASD is a low dose of ADHD medications. And they found that to be very effective for kids. So, so really it's about figuring out what the child's needs are, advocating for those needs to be met, educating yourself while not scaring yourself, and realizing that by and large, these kids can lead very happy, what is a normal life. And as you know, I mean, how many people have biological children who have autism, who have learning disabilities, who have medical issues? There's often no way to know for sure where the behaviors, where the needs are coming from. And so the bottom line is understanding there could be a whole spectrum of needs, meeting your child where they're at, advocating for the resources that they need. I know in New Hampshire, children who've had substance exposure in utero automatically qualify for early supports and services. Like when they come into care, that's the first referral that DCYF makes. And even if there's nothing in the screening, there's no direct needs, they automatically qualify for services. So at a minimum, they might have an OT that comes into the home. With our daughter, it was once a month. She came in and she was just tracking her progress to make sure she wasn't falling behind. She graduated from OT and now sees a speech therapist. She is a little bit behind in her, mostly her enunciation. She has lots of words, you just can't understand all of them.
But in Mass, you don't automatically qualify if you're substance exposed, but there's a social aspect of qualifying for early intervention. And and that's how we get most of DCF kids into early intervention, is because of the social aspect and the trauma that they were exposed to early in life.
Do you mean that's how you have leverage?
Yes, that's how we have
Yes.
leverage. There is a social factor when one of my youngest, my foster child, they came out to the house, she was not substance exposed, she had a traumatic injury, there was, but no neurological damage. She didn't technically qualify for early interventions because she had no delays, but because of the social factor of being in a home where she suffered a pretty significant injury,
right,
and then came into foster care, that socially qualified her for early intervention.
Yeah.
So from 0 to 3, that's when early intervention, early supports and services is in place. Once they turn 3, if there's ongoing needs, the local school district will take over. But we chose with our son, the school district didn't feel like he qualified for OT within the school because his needs weren't affecting his learning. We have him in private OT, which his Medicaid covers, so we don't have to pay for it. But he's been doing that for about a year, and he's about done. She's worked as much as she can to help him. Her report is going to recommend the school does provide OT because he still struggles with holding things. He has end range, what they call end range tremors, his fingers and toes. He has shakiness, and so and he has a lot of weakness in his hands, so it makes it very hard for him to grip a pencil. He struggles with handwriting, things like that. So we anticipate that the school is going to need to take over from that.
And if they don't, and Medicaid doesn't, because unfortunately, when you're getting physical therapy or occupational therapy, there's a goal, there's an end part. So there's going to be a point where insurance isn't going to pay anymore. If you look at your local colleges, in my area, in the Springfield area, Springfield College has a really great PTOT program, and they actually do a group for kids with complex medical needs, where the OT students, under the supervision of their professor, will provide occupational therapy and physical therapy for kids. One of the daycares right near Springfield College, the students will actually go into the daycare and provide occupational therapy to some of the daycare students as well.
So there are resources available. somebody in the last session was asking, what we recommend for resources. Definitely look locally, connect with other foster and adoptive parents. One of the biggest things that we have struggled with is trying to figure out, is this normal? Is this, is this how, at the time a 3-year-old boy acts? We had a daughter, we had never raised a boy. Is this just this difference between boys and girls? Is this his trauma? Is this something else? And we found the support of the foster and adoptive community super helpful. First of all, in just advising us and providing resources. Other families who've already been around the block a few times often have great resources. Everything from a pediatrician that's trauma informed to the best OT or PT, things like that. And the other thing is it's other people who understand what you're going through, because the reality is, no matter whether a child comes into care from birth or at 12 years old, they've experienced trauma. And even if the only trauma they've experienced was in utero and then being removed from their biological family, it's still trauma. And they're going to have needs that children who haven't been through trauma don't have. And having a support system that understands that. We have great, we already had a great support system. We have a faith community. Our family was very supportive when we did this. My sister and brother-in-law both worked for PCOF for years out in California. But it's still, like, when we're all together, you can kind of see the eyebrows raised sometimes. And, but our foster peeps get it. Like, they get it. They understand, that our child's not a monster. He's just dysregulated right now and struggling. They understand why we're not parenting him the way, my dad lives with us, and there was a couple times where he's like, he just needs a spank, and I'm like, no, he does not. That's actually the worst thing we can do right now.
Yeah, you're gonna spin my control that way.
Exactly. But that was his generation. That was, and so we quickly educated him on why that was A, illegal, and B, not the best choice for him. But yeah, so having our foster and adoptive friends who understand, who know that you can love your kid and just really not like them in the moment, or you can
that's okay.
And that's okay. It's okay to not like your kids. It's not like you don't like your kid, you don't like their behavior. It can be very stressful, and you really do need that support of other people who understand what you're going through. There's things I can say to my foster mommy friends that I could not say to anyone else, because they get it.
Absolutely. And here in Mass, each regional office has a foster care support group. You just have to connect with your office to figure out where it is. I know that in my region out west, they have a support group in East Longmeadow that meets once a month. There are also online resources in my area as well. We have a closed foster care Facebook group, and DCF employees aren't allowed in the group, so the foster parents are allowed to speak openly and freely about issues that they're going through, not only with their foster children, but in their relationships with the department. MSPCC, Mass Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children.
Good job!
Lisa was in the last session, so she told us this resource. They have a lot of parenting training classes.
Is it ChildNet? Is that what it's called?
KidsNet.
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 Yes, KidsNet.
They have a lot of trainings. Once you're licensed, you'll get emails from MSPCC and KidsNet telling you when trainings are going to be in your area. Your social worker with the department is also going to be a great resource. Therapy. Don't be afraid to get therapy. Not only for yourself, but for your kids as well. One of my kids is in child parent play psychotherapy, which I thought, how are you going to be able to help my child by sitting there and playing cards with him or playing dolls with him? But apparently it's been very effective. He did it for 3 years before he transitioned to a different therapist. You're not going to cure FASD or substance exposure, but what you can do is treat the symptoms and help support your child to learn how to deal with the different way that they cognitively see things, or they're not bad or wrong, they're just different. And sometimes even as a parent, you have to learn how to deal with these things a little bit differently. We did in-home therapy. We also did IHBT, which is in-home behavioral therapy. IHBT is fantastic. I'm a great proponent of that, because they not only see the child, but they see the family as well. So they come in sometimes and they would say, okay, we're not gonna see your child today, we're gonna see you. And we're gonna sit down and we're gonna go over some things that have gone on with your child in the past week since we were here last, and how you reacted to them, and how maybe you could react differently in the future to cause less conflict. Kids like my son, who was exposed to heroin, cocaine, Subutex, marijuana, and although mom denies alcohol, I'm kind of wondering if she binge drank here and there as well. He's got all these typical symptoms. He can't function. He's always on fast forward. He's loud. He's very sensory. When he puts his spoon in his bowl, it's clank. He can't hold his spoon properly. He has to hold it like this sometimes. So we started out with a pediatrician. This is what we're seeing. What do we need to do? We did a Vanderbilt, which is a paper test for ADHD. And he scored really, really high. But at the time, he was 3 years old. And they don't treat kids for ADHD at 3 years old. They wait until around 5. So that's when we started the child parent play psychotherapy. And we held out, and I really didn't want to give my son medication, but he needed it. He couldn't function without it. So right around age 5, we started ADHD meds. And we ran through the gamut. We tried methylphenidate, then we went to Quillavent, and now we're on Concerta, which really seems to help him a lot. Fortunately, it kind of slows him down enough so that he can function at a somewhat normal level. Yes?
In terms of like the treatments, the medication and all this, where are you in terms of like legal risk or finalized adoption? I'm trying to figure out like who's making these decisions. Like, is it you? Is it DCF? Is it the birth parent? Is that like conflicting?
So once the child's in DCF custody, DCF is the guardian. So the foster parent in conjunction with the DCF social worker will make the decisions. Especially now there's a push for the department to not allow a lot of polypharmacy, which is many medications. And they're developing a review process for kids that are on 4 or more medications.
Because some kids are coming into care on multiple medications.
6, 7, 8
Yeah.
medications, and
Yeah.
they drool on themselves.
Yeah.
So while the child is still in the custody of the department, you, the foster parent, and the department are going to, in conjunction, make these decisions, which is why it's really great to keep up good communication with your social worker. Once he was adopted, then it's all you.
From your experience, is the foster parent kind of empowered to like make changes, look for changes, suggest changes if the child's
Absolutely.
on 6, like, and being
Yes.
like, okay,
Yeah.
can we try this
Absolutely.
without medication and see
Yeah.
how this goes?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
but at this point, he had already been in therapy for a couple of years, and the therapist was pushing for the medication, the pediatrician was pushing for medication. We even did a neuropsych eval to find out where all this was coming from. And you know, although I don't like the medications, they're really effective for him, and he always knows when we forget a dose because he gets a 1 o'clock in the afternoon dose, and that's the hardest dose in the world to remember to give him.
Yeah.
And he knows he'll come up to me around 2:30. He says, "Daddy, you forgot my medicine. I am having a really hard time right now." And he's 8. He'll be 9 in November,
Right.
but he's
Yeah.
like, "Daddy, you need to help now."
Yes.
So he's
And
really good at that.
We both talked about before we had kids that we, no medications, I'll never medicate my
I'll
kid.
never medicate my kids.
The reality is that if it's what your child, what is worse? Them not being able to function and them struggling 24/7, or having some medication that really helps them, especially, we're not just dealing with like substance exposure, we're dealing with trauma. And so sometimes for kids, you may find as the child gets older, they don't need all that medication, but for right now, this is what they need to help them function.
And for my son, actually, it's slowing him down enough so he can learn coping mechanisms.
Right.
Though he still struggles with that.
Yeah.
It's a work in progress.
I'm a strong proponent in learning trauma interventions. The one that's kind of becoming mainstream in New Hampshire is TBRI, If you Google TBRI, it stands for Trust-Based Relational Intervention. It was actually developed by Karen Purvis, and they did years and years of research on kids, specifically in foster care, but kids who come from trauma, and understanding how trauma changes the brain. It literally changes the brain, and how to help children overcome that. The brain can heal. There was a lot of old research that thought the brain was like solid at 5 years old. Like once kids hit 5, there was nothing you could do. And research has shown that's so not true. The brain can heal, and one of the biggest ways it can heal is through connection with a loving caregiver. And so TBRI really focuses on learning what's happened to your child's brain because of their trauma, and that trauma can be like our daughter had. I mean, she came home to us from the NICU, so her trauma was all in vitro, plus her birth and delivery were very traumatic. But she didn't go years being neglected and abused, but she still has some issues. This has changed her brain, and so learning how to help them heal through connection, giving them their voice back, really can go a long way in helping them get to a point, just like the medication, get to a point where they can cope. Because the reality is, they talk in TBRI about upstairs brain and downstairs brain. And your upstairs brain is where all of like the real thinking happens. Your downstairs brain is like the reactionary part of your brain. It's the fight or flight. Kids who've been through trauma, like babies, have you guys heard of the Moro reflex that babies have? Yeah, it's the startle reflex. Kids who've been through trauma often don't lose that reflex.
Yeah.
When we took our son for his OT screening, that was the first thing she noticed, was that reflex he was 6 when he started, was still engaged. That's not normal, but that's what happens to kids in trauma. So what happens is any situation where that's new to him, that's out of his comfort zone, that he's not familiar with, or in any way provides fear for him, he goes down into that downstairs part of his brain. He's in his fight or flight mode. He is not going to be able to learn. He is not going to be able to regulate himself. He is, his teacher this year was like, well, I'm confused about his math facts, because some days he knows them all and other days he doesn't. And as his mom, I'm going, what was going on that day when he didn't know his math facts? Was something different going on in the classroom? Had he just come in from recess? Anything like that. So understanding, and I have to remind myself that we were talking all summer has been a little hard with some of the kiddos when they're not in their normal routines. And last night we had a big old meltdown, and I had to remind myself, like, he's not thinking rationally like that right now. A 7-year-old, you can usually start to rationalize with them and explain things. He was not in a place where he could hear any rational thought. So we just had to leave him, let him kind of decompress, and then we came back to the issue. But just reminding yourself that trauma does change the brain. There are things you can do to heal it, and that kids' behavior is always trying to give a message, and our job as parents is to figure out what is that message. Yep.
How do you talk to your kids about their substance exposure?
Our kids are young enough that we have not had that conversation
How old are they
yet.
again, sorry?
They're 7 and 2.5. He's probably gonna start learning because he's going for a screening in August, so he's gonna start hearing fetal alcohol, so we're gonna have to have those conversations. You have to be very careful to discuss the substance exposure without speaking negatively about their bio family.
Yep.
It's very important that you address specifically what they themselves went through, and you don't attach that to a negative connotation towards their bio family. He remembers his bio mom. He loves her. We love her. I don't ever want him to think badly of her because of this, but it is going to be a reality for him that he was exposed to alcohol, and that he may have struggles for the rest of his life because of that. So I guess my answer is just very carefully.
And in our case, we've had the conversation already with a couple of the kids, because maturity-wise, they can handle the conversation. But my youngest son, there's no way he could grasp what happened yet. And eventually, he'll be 9 soon, but eventually he'll have the maturity to understand what we're talking about. And then we're also try not to criminalize the mother
Right.
about the choices that she made.
Right.
You know, a lot of our conversations around the bio parents are, you know, even adults make choices that aren't the best choices sometimes, and we try not to make them out to be the bad guy. Because at least, well, almost all of my kids see some parts of their families from time to time. We do have relationships. My youngest son, his mother's actually clean now. She's clean, she's in a stable relationship, she has another child now that she's parenting, and things are going really well for her. But there's still a lot of trauma around when he lived with her and her boyfriend at the time. And he still struggles through that. And it still brings out every time we have a visit. We have a visit twice a year. And every time we have a visit, some of that stuff comes out again.
And even if in some cases they're not old enough yet to really comprehend the exposure itself, their behavior is different.
Mm-hmm.
How do you give them tools to understand their own behavior, to explain their behavior to others? Do other people observe their behavior? I mean, they do. And so
Yes.
do they explain themselves? Do they want to? How do you talk about any of that?
My kids don't explain themselves. That's usually up to me.
Yeah.
They know that, so my youngest son, again, he knows that he behaves differently than other kids, and he knows that he struggles. But he can't articulate it that way, because even though he's almost 9, really he's 6.
Yeah.
And he still struggles a lot with emotions and boundaries and just behavior in general. I think he's come a really long way, and we celebrate the successes and try to minimize the negative aspects of it. And you were talking earlier about something that was the hardest thing for me to do was not jump in at a negative behavior like that. That sometimes you have to let things go for a little bit, and that's something I learned from in-home behavioral therapy. Sometimes you have to let things go for a little bit, and you can't always punish a child for behavior. You really have to celebrate the good parts of the behaviors and talk through things with them. Taking away privileges from my son he laughs. He doesn't care.
Kids, we talked about this in the last session. Kids who come from trauma, punitive discipline is rarely effective. And if anything, what that can do is actually harm your connection and your attachment with the child. Attachment-based, connected-based parenting really teaches that the most important thing is your connection with the child. So a lot of times that means you let things go. It's also understanding that kids do well when they can, not just when they want to. I think, you know, our society would say if somebody's misbehaving, it's because they want to misbehave. The reality is no kid wants to misbehave. Children do well when they can. So our job as parents is to help them do well. And if they're not, to help figure out why. Not to punish them because they're not doing well. And so that comes from everything of making sure kids who've been through trauma, this was something I didn't know, they are much more prone to things like dehydration and hypoglycemia. So making sure they always have plenty of water and have protein. Like nobody understands why, but it's just the science that's been done on how trauma changes the brain, that they can be more susceptible to those things. We used to really kind of monitor and restrict our son's fluid intake because he struggles with wetting the bed. And after I learned that kids from trauma are more prone to dehydration, we started making, like, you drink as much water as you want, we'll deal with, we'll wear pull-ups until you're 10, I don't care. You need to be hydrated. But just little things like that, just learning that their behavior is trying to give a message. They don't always know what that message is. It's your job as the parent to figure out what that message is. And it can be exhausting. That's why we talk about the support, because it can be exhausting. You need to have people who understand what you're going through.
It's also important to spy on your kids.
Yes. Yes.
Honestly, it is,
Yes.
because one of the things that we were having struggles with was looking for his triggers.
Yeah.
What's going to set off a meltdown, or what's going to set off a bad situation. And he was having signals that we could see. We just weren't recognizing it. And that's where the IHBT was very helpful for us, because they just kind of sat back and watched it direct.
Ooh, that was
Goodness,
good.
okay. I get a free ride while I'm here. There were triggers, there were signs that you could see, we just weren't recognizing them. And one of the things that my son does particularly is he'll come up when he's starting to get a little dysregulated. He says, "Daddy, can you play with me right now? I need you to play with me right this second, right now." And I'm like, "Well, honey, I'm changing your brother's diaper. I have to hook up his tube feeding." And he's like, "Daddy, I need you to play with me right now." And that's, sometimes you have to recognize that he needs that distraction because he can tell something's starting to spin a little bit and he's getting a little dysregulated. So spying on him and watching him and just kind of observing while he's doing something, you can tell when he's starting to ramp up a little bit.
Yeah. Somebody had a question.
Oh, yes, ma'am.
How did you know that these are the kids that you wanted to adopt? I mean, did you just read the information about the child on paper? I forget what you said at the beginning. Or did you have any?
I have a feeling your answer is going to be a little more complex than mine. Our son actually, we had started foster care classes. I mentioned we have one biological child. We struggled with secondary infertility for years, several miscarriages. I had been praying about foster care and adoption, and my husband just wasn't there. We started the classes and never finished. He came home one day because some friends of ours that were foster parents had learned about this little boy that needed a pre-adoptive home. He was still legal risk, but the case had taken it had looked like he was going to reunify, and the case took a very backward dive. And the family he was with did not want to adopt him. And in fact, we were at the point they wanted him out of their home. They were really struggling with his behaviors. And my husband came home that night and said, "Call DCYF tomorrow." Okay, I've been waiting for this for a long time. So we actually, they don't do this anymore, but we were permitted very quickly. My husband's a police officer, so his background check they knew was gonna come back clean. But within 3 weeks he was in our home, and we just never looked back. We have any child that's come into our home, we've done foster care. Our daughter actually came in as a foster child. We fostered her. She wasn't adopted till she was 19 months old. We have been open to keeping any child that came into our home forever. That's just kind of how we've operated. We kind of treat it like marriage, like we're in it. We've had several children reunify very positively that we still have contact with their bio families. We had one emergency placement of a sibling group that because of safety reasons that don't often come up, but there were some safety concerns with bio dad. They did have to be moved. But other than that, any child that came into our home, we were open to keeping. So that was just kind of our philosophy.
With us, we were kind of, at first my husband didn't want to have kids. So it was a little bit of a struggle at first, but he really got into it after a while. Our first child came to us because we knew his mother. So DCF wasn't involved, but because private adoption is not legal in the state of Mass, you have to go through an agency. We ended up becoming his legal guardian, and he came to live with us at 3 months old. We get him stabilized. He has a lot of medical issues, a lot of complications. So we took a little break, and we were with a private adoption agency for 3 years. We had no success whatsoever. We were never matched with a child. We never had a temporary placement. It was a religious agency, so I have some suspicion that may have been part of a problem. But then I also, after we left that agency, we got a copy of our home study and it was completely inaccurate. So that could have been the bigger problem. So look at your home study.
Yes.
Your social worker is going to let you review it.
Yeah.
Make sure it's accurate. And then a friend of ours started up an agency that worked through all 50 states with DCF. Thank you. With DCF agencies, and that's where we got our second son, which is funny because we had actually put in for him a year previously through the Adopt Us Kids website, and we were denied. And then with the new agency and a completely different home study, we were actually selected as an emergency placement because his foster parents were retiring. So we got him from Oregon. And then at the time we had German Shepherds, and DCF doesn't like German Shepherds, unfortunately, although they're fantastic dogs and they're great with kids. But once our last German Shepherd passed away, and we moved into a bigger house, we called DCF right away and said, hey, how do we go through the process? We got home studied, and we were, we specifically wanted to adopt some more kids. We had 2 boys, we were looking for a girl, although sometimes I regret that decision. My daughter is 9, going on 36.
Yeah.
She has already perfected the death stare and the eye roll.
Yeah.
And the silver tongue, the sharp tongue. So we hooked up with DCF, and we were very broad with what we were looking for. We didn't say, oh, no substance exposed kids, no sexually exposed, sexual abused kids. No, a couple of things that we did say was no fire starters. No fire starters and no cruelty to animals, because we've always been a family that has a lot of animals. And we were okay taking legal risk kids. We were also okay taking temporary placements. Most of our kids came to us as temporary placements. Apparently we got a little bit of a reputation with the department that we'd be willing to take most anything. Because our 2 oldest kids are very medically complicated, we didn't want to take medically complicated kids. 2's enough. But we've had several placements that were reunified with their biological families. We have a few placements that have gone on to live with relatives. We've had some really big surprises where we thought we were going to adopt, and they ended up going back to somebody else. But our youngest son, he came to us, he was an emergency placement. We were his 7th placement in 6 months. He was a pretty wild child. This is my one that had all these exposures. And his current foster home gave notice and said, you need to move him now. So I got a call from our family resource worker, said, hey, I've got a kid out in the Pittsfield area office, needs a home. I think you guys would do really well with him. Sure, I'll pick him up tomorrow. And let's see, he was 2 when we got him. He had just turned 7 when we adopted him, and he'll be 9 in a few months. So we've had him for quite a while. And that's how, let's see, the 2 middle ones came to us. Their placement's disrupting. The foster family that was going to adopt them is now no longer going to adopt them. So they came to us, and they've been with us ever since. And then our foster child right now, after we had finished with number 5's adoption, we're not going to adopt anymore, but we're going to do respite. And I highly encourage you to do respite.
Yes.
Weekend respite
Yeah.
for other foster families is a fantastic thing, and you get to know a lot of kids. So my youngest child, my youngest daughter, she came to us as a weekend respite. She came into care. She had a traumatic head injury caused by someone. Nobody knows how it happened.
Somebody knows how it happened.
Yeah, exactly. Somebody knows how it happened because somebody cracked her skull.
Yeah.
But she came to us straight from the hospital. That area office had taken 5 other babies into custody that same day, so I'm getting a call at 1 o'clock on a Friday. I have no place for this baby to go. Can you take her for the weekend? Of course, we already know you're a nurse and she's being discharged from the hospital, so we feel safe with you. She stayed through the weekend. Social worker called me Monday morning, what time do you want me to pick her up? I'm like, well, my husband didn't work on Mondays. I said, well, Dennis is home all day today. You can always pick her up tomorrow. He can keep her through the day. She's a great baby. She slept through the night. From day 1, she was 3 months old.
Oh, you're so lucky.
Slept through the night, she still does.
That's amazing.
So the social worker said, we don't have any place for her to go. So she's just going to go from night to night, from different hotline home to different hotline home. So I said, well, we both work full time. If you get us daycare, we'll keep her as long as you need us to. It was 2.5 years ago. And now we're going to TPR on the 30th. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah. What Eric said about respite, I really encourage, even if you are strictly adopt only, you don't want to foster, you don't want to do legal risk, be open to respite for a couple reasons. One, it connects you with other foster parents and social workers. And 2, it exposes you to kids. And I think I mentioned before, I can't remember if this session or last session, what you read on paper, what you read in a profile, it can sound very scary. If I had read some of my son's behaviors on paper, I would have said, heck no. But when you have a child in your home, those behaviors look very different than what they read on paper. And I have found many adopt-only families in New Hampshire, when they open up to doing respite, they all of a sudden are like, oh, I guess a 7-year-old wouldn't be so bad, or oh, wow, this 12-year-old was actually like fit really well in our family. It can really open your parameters. It can open your eyes to the reality of what a child from trauma looks like. And I think it can take away a lot of the scariness. Your first placement's always going to be your scariest. And even now, we've been on a break for a while, and I find like it's kind of scary to say yes again because we haven't said yes for a while. But you just got to dive in and go for it.
And to specifically answer your question, as hard as you try not to, you're going to fall in love with every child that's placed with you.
And that's a good
hard
thing.
not
It's
to.
okay. It's okay to love them even if they leave. They need it.
They need
deserve
somebody
it.
to love them.
Yeah.
And even if it's only for a few weeks or a few months, you're going to love them and you're going to be heartbroken when they leave. But you're going to tell yourself that
It
you
mattered.
gave a solid foundation to that child to make them successful in their next journey. And that's what I tell myself every single time I lose a placement.
Yeah.
And it still hurts. It still hurts to lose a placement. But I've done what I can to improve that child's life.
Did you have
And that's what's important to us.
question?